Welcome back to Whose Line Is It Planarcadia, the planet where everything's made up and the jokes don't matter. That's right, the jokes are like all the things I theorized about in the last episode because every single one of them was probably wrong. And by that I mean they were all wrong, but with caveats. But we'll get to that later in the video because it is time for our first game of the night. Riddle me this. What happened in Planarcadia last episode? Stay tuned to find out. Following Jade's invitation to join the IPC's Anti-Destruction Alliance after that close call with Iron Tomb, the Nameless decide it's time for vacation, so they head to Himiko's homeworld of Planarcadia because the planet's moon has grown full once again, which marks the start of the Phantasmoon Games. Himiko and Welt started their vacation by talking business with one of the IPC's 10 Stonehearts and CEO of Planarcadia, Pearl, only to discover that the IPC wants to control the Phantasmoon Games for profit. And while the senior Nameless were busy negotiating the terms of their involvement with the Alliance, Dan Heng and Sunday decided to look for General Yao Guang, the Xianzhou delegate, since they had also received an invitation to join the Anti-Destruction Alliance, which left March and the Trailblazer with nothing to do except follow Sparkle around on a tour of Duo Mention City, which somehow led to the Trailblazer taking over a tabloid newspaper operated by Furbo journalists who were abandoned by their former boss, Nihilux. At the end of the tour, Sparkle leaves them at the plaza where they're immediately recognized by Planarcadia's #1 streamer, Sparksy, one of Sparkle's many alter egos. She nearly gets arrested by Kuchiba of the Department of Aberration Defense after she pulls a little prank on the Nameless, but she escaped after expressing interest in joining the Phantasmoon Games, something the Trailblazer is also interested in doing. But to join the games, you need one of the 8 official supplicant masks, and fortunately for the Trailblazer, Himiko knew exactly where they could find one. She had participated in the games 15 years ago, after which she left her mask in the hands of her friend Dolly at Graphia Academy. Unfortunately, Sparksy overheard this conversation and managed to trap March, Welt, and the Trailblazer in Graphia Academy while she tried to hunt down the mask for herself. She eventually found and convinced Dolly to give her the mask by pretending to be the Trailblazer, and once the mask was on her face, she officially entered the Phantasmoon Games as a supplicant. And she used her newfound status to have the Academy students hunt down the Nameless so that she could toy with them on stream. March and Welt got captured, but the Trailblazer escaped into the world on canvas thanks to Evanescia, who painted them a new supplicant mask and then sent them back to the 3D plane to save March and Welt. But they were quickly found by Sparkle, who had her own score to settle with Sparksy, so the Trailblazer and Sparkle decided to work together to take Sparksy down. Meanwhile, Dan Heng and Sunday were having a time tracking down the Xianzhou delegate because she had plans of her own, and they involved tracking down another supplicant mask, which was in the possession of the Sinwish Syndicate. She wanted to use it to thwart fate by ensuring a disaster that she foresaw relating to Blade never came to pass. So Yao Guang had Ting Yun infiltrate the group by pretending to be Blade, while Dan Heng and Sunday pretended to be his assassin co-workers. But when they do finally get their hands on the mask, Yao Guang slams it on Sunday's face and forces him into the games whether he likes it or not. And this screws up Silverwolf's plan because she was the one originally after that mask. So she recruited the help of Detective Asheville to help her find another mask. But he rats her out immediately to Pearl, who has 3 masks of her own. One is set aside for Asheville, one for herself, and a third spare mask that Silverwolf makes a deal with Pearl to get. Elsewhere in the city, the uncaptured Nameless, Sparkle, Yao Guang, and Ting Yun hatch a plan to take down Sparksy. This means traveling to the World's End Tavern and enlisting Sampo's help to gather intel on Sparksy's plan. Turns out she's trying to use a mimetic virus to turn everyone in Planarcadia into her. Fortunately, Aha likes the Trailblazer, so after Sparkle has a bit of an identity crisis, they gave the Trailblazer a copy of the Slumber Nanomimetic virus from their Smiling Spatial Rift to use as protection while they collect fragments of Graphia's mural from around the Academy. Because apparently only water from that mural can wash everyone's minds clean of Sparksy's virus. Sparksy launches a counterattack by fusing with Sparkle, but the Trailblazer knocked her out with a bat and saved the day! But while everyone's attention was focused on the battle between Sparksy and the Trailblazer, over in Dovebrook, 34 people were murdered by what appeared to be the same mass murderer from the Phantasmoon Games of 15 years ago. The Herald of Death, or just a copycat. Spoiler alert, it's the copycat. Because according to Kuchiba, the original killer, Marcus Antali, was identified and executed 5 years ago. But whether or not this killer is real or fake, Asheville still wanted to investigate the matter himself, as a supplicant in the Phantasmoon Games. Now, several of the OG Herald of Death's casualties were Himiko's classmates during a terrifying incident in one of Graphia Academy's classrooms. And among those survivors were Himiko and Fulwish. Himiko's survival was quite remarkable, actually, as she had chased him all the way to Dovebrook, fought him, and won against him. And that's how the Herald of Death was arrested. And Himiko was in the middle of explaining this incident to the Trailblazer when a man claiming to be her father interrupted them, claiming his daughter Himiko had died during that incident. And it was on that cliff that the patch left us hanging. But that's also where the new quest begins, which is great because I wouldn't want to leave that mystery unresolved for a whole nother patch, you know? But it turns out that mystery wasn't much of a mystery. Himiko's father, Ryusuke, was just messing with everybody. Due to circumstances, he was a bit of an absentee father and wasn't able to recognize Himiko at first because he hadn't seen her in a long time. But his accusation of dead daughter disease wasn't totally unwarranted. See, Himiko is the last descendant of the legendary painter Graphia, the same Graphia who saved the entirety of Planarcadia by winning the Phantasmoon Games and using her 1 minute of Eonhood to seal the planet within the 2D world on canvas in order to protect it from the Antimatter Legion. But that miracle came at a cost. Both Graphia and her descendants would forever suffer from the Weathering Curse. This curse caused the men in the family to succumb to madness while the women began to fray and peel like old acrylic paintings until they died, typically quite young, around 30. Ryusuke had lost his wife to the curse and couldn't bear the idea of losing his daughter to it too. So for most of Himiko's life, he was traveling the cosmos looking for a way to break the curse, only to return 15 years ago to an empty house and a tombstone with Himiko's name on it. He was so broken up over her death and not being there for her while she was alive that he even recreated the crime scene from the moment when he thought she died, presumably as a sort of memorial for her. That's what this classroom is. But Himiko claims that she made that tombstone to get her affairs in order before she left to travel on the Astral Express, but I'm a little skeptical that that's all there is to it. Mostly because she explicitly says that she suffered from the Weathering Curse herself. And yet, she looks fine. There's no peeling, no cracking, no fading, and certainly no death. So that raises the question, how did Himiko survive the curse when no one else in her lineage could? And not for lack of trying either. One of her family members had even won the Phantasmoon Games and tried to use their 1 minute of Eonhood to break the curse and couldn't do it. Now, I've already shared my thoughts on this in another video, so I'm not going to rehash it here, especially since I think that the theory is still viable. But the important thing to keep in mind is that the matter of Himiko's death is not totally resolved yet. And we've got plenty of father-daughter tension to resolve in the meantime. But we'll take care of that later. Right now, we've got a meeting with Pearl to catch over at the Pearluxe Corporation. And on the way to the meeting, March decides to stop and pick up a copy of Fluffy Across the Blue, a rather embellished retelling of the adventures of the Nameless as tiny anthropomorphic animals with questionable levels of accuracy. Serendipitously, Asheville happens to be nearby, chatting up a recruiter from the Research Society of Happy Smiles, who leaves as soon as the Trailblazer arrives. Asheville then explains that the copycat murders of the Fulwish Syndicate seem to lead back to the Research Society of Happy Smiles, so he's been investigating them with limited success. And that also means that the new Herald of Death, or the copycat, is directly connected to this, cult. Now, as the CEO of Planarcadia, there's some information about the case that only Pearl has access to, so Asheville tags along with the Nameless on their trip to Pearluxe Corp to question her himself. And as a testament to the IPC's mastery over streamlined imagenesis, Pearluxe Corp is full of giant mechatrons, much to Welt's delight. And as Asheville heads off on his own, a wild Nihilux appears. She introduces herself as an IPC employee, which is a lie, and then she acts as our surprise Pearluxe Corp tour guide. During this tour, they meet Cinderborn, one of the 4 members of the popular live-action hero show Daybreak Squadron, broadcasting now on Fulwish TV. Cinderborn had a pretty rough childhood. His parents died at the hands of the Herald of Death during the Bloodstained Games, so with no one to guide him and take care of him, he got caught up in the wrong crowds pretty early on, specifically with the Fulwish Syndicate. It was only after stumbling across the Nameless's adventures and Fluffy Across the Blue that he decided to turn his life around, and now he's basically a hero in training. Although he's definitely still lacking in the confidence department. Now keep in mind that this is Planarcadia, the planet where imagination and reality collide. So this guy doesn't just play a Mechatron warrior hero on TV, he and his squad are actually approved by the Department of Aberration Defense to fight evil and help citizens in the real world as well. So I guess that makes Daybreak Squadron a reality TV show. Anyway, he invites the Trailblazer to test out a freshly imagined Mechatron's mock combat capability against the whole Daybreak Squadron in the recording studio. And we can't turn that down now, can we? So while piloting their fully operational Astral Express themed Mechatron, the Trailblazer takes out the entire Daybreak Squadron with ease. Although some of them seem to think the fight was a lot closer than it actually was. There even seems to be some guilt tripping involved here. Like, maybe they could have won if only Cinderborn had been converted like the other 3 had. But what seems like an innocent comment in the spirit of competition actually has some sinister implications. But we'll talk about that later because we've kept Pearl waiting long enough. It is time to go to her office and learn more about the Herald of Death. Pearl tells us that the reappearance of the Herald of Death has caused her a great deal of concern, so there's been a bit of a change of plans. The IPC can try and take over the Phantasmoon games another time. For now, she just wants to bring them to a swift conclusion through whatever means necessary, and she wants the Nameless's help to pull it off. After all, they have 2 supplicants among their number, although Sunday's participation comes as a bit of a surprise to her. Pearl then asks them what they would do with their 1 minute of Eonhood should they win. And I don't think anything could have prepared her for the Trailblazers' response. I mean, who could have predicted that they'd choose to use their 1 minute of Eonhood to coerce AHA into leading the Anti-Destruction Alliance? And I love this idea so much. And I also love the fact that when the Nameless are wondering if this would even work, Pom-Pom's just like, oh yeah, it'll work, no problem. We've got blackmail material on the Eon of Elation. And I also love how AHA's IOU shows how close they were with Akavili. It really gives the impression that the 2 of them were chaotic besties of sorts. Anyway, it seems like Pearl is amenable to the idea of AHA leading the alliance if they can pull it off, but she does have her own wish to fulfill if she wins instead. She wants to recreate Graphia's Imogenesis miracle, or at least understand and execute the underlying principles of it, because that is her life's purpose. Now, I don't want to go too deep into this, but basically all Intellitrons come from planet Screwlum's celestial differentiator. And as you may or may not recall, the planet and the differentiator originally belonged to Rubert, and can thus be traced back to Xandar, who both made and technically is Noose. As life forms born under the cosmic mind, Intellitrons are created to fulfill their assigned purpose, which in Pearl's case is the study of art. And Graphia's work is perhaps the epitome of all art and all Imogenesis. So her goal in life is to become the Pearl that masters Imogenesis. So in Imogenesis Pearl. Genshin players will get that one. So whose perspective will dominate the game in the end? Pearl has 2 allies in Silverwolf and Ashvale, and the Trailblazer has Sparksy and Sunday because apparently Sparksy is an ally now. So that's 3 on 3, with 2 additional supplicants unaccounted for. So those 2 remaining supplicants are kind of a problem, because if the supplicants are split into 2 even teams, then the games become a lot easier to control. So Pearl suggests focusing on the Herald of Death and the 2 remaining unknown supplicants for now. But what she doesn't realize is that there are actually 3 unknown supplicants, because the Trailblazer's mask is a bonus mask that Evanescia painted. That'll be a fun surprise for later. Anyway, Pearl suggests luring the last 2 supplicants out of hiding by taunting them with an exposition featuring the Astral Express and Fluffy Across the Blue, appropriately titled Star Rail Fest. And if they work together, they'll be able to generate a ton of wish power and climb the rankings quickly. After all, the entire affair will be televised on Fulwish TV, so everyone's gonna see it. And now that the plans are made, Pearl gifts them an aventurine-themed tracking device and sends them on their way so that she can have a little chat with Ashvale. Because Ashvale needs a little bit more convincing. He's not very keen on her plan. After all, this Star Rail Fest is a perfect stage for the Herald of Death's copycat to make a televised return. But Pearl knows this, and that's why she asks him to trail the Nameless and keep an eye out for any suspicious activity. But before he agrees, he has some questions for her. His investigation revealed that all of the compensation money paid out to the families of the Herald of Death's victims came directly from the IPC's technology department, and he suspects that Pearl may have had a hand in covering up what happened to the killer. She didn't, but we'll talk about that more in a bit. Pearl does share what she knows, though. She identifies the Herald of Death as Marcus Antali, a former member of the Intelligentsia Guild's School of Evolutionary Perfection, and the guild is effectively run by the IPC's technology department. More on this relationship later. So with this intel, Ashvale quickly narrows down his list of primary suspects to just the investigators from the Security Bureau and the Department of Aberration Defense, since they were the only ones involved with the investigation of the original killings, and would therefore be in the best position to recreate the murder method. Well, that is if you don't include the victims themselves. Now, I want to say he's a little bit off here in his assumptions, but let's just say that this quest has made me very suspicious of Kuchiba, and she's the head of the Department of Aberration Defense. So we'll come back to that in a second. Now, it's also important to note that the Research Society of Happy Smiles was created from a mutual aid group composed of the Bloodstained Game survivors. And the leader of this organization is Fulwish, the current owner and founder of Fulwish TV. Fulwish is very anti-IPC. She thinks it's the IPC's fault that Planarcadia can't live under the influence of true elation, so she's kind of blaming them for bringing suffering and conflict to the world. Her only desire in life is to eliminate suffering and sadness altogether so that everyone can feel the joy of elation, and she's convinced everyone in her Society of Smiles that this is a great idea. And after only a very brief confrontation with Fulwish, Ashvale and Kuchiba realize realize that there is something very, very wrong with this woman and her followers. She didn't create a mutual aid group at all, she created a cult. And she's just broadcast the details about the Herald of Death's murder method to every single one of her followers, and you just know they're gonna start spreading this information like wildfire. After all, the bloodstained games are a source of trauma for the entirety of Planarcadia, and there are few things more contagious than fear. Now, Ashvale suspects that she might actually be a supplicant in disguise because her powers of persuasion seem a little too powerful, and he's once again half right. But Fulwish won't give him any more information, and they need more information, so they decide to corner a familiar face in an alleyway, for questioning. And that familiar face is Cinderborn from the Daybreak Squadron. He's actually one of the members of the Smile Society, and he insists that Fulwish is a good person who genuinely wants to help people heal from their trauma, and that as much as he would love to destroy the new Herald of Death with his own hands, he's not willing to implicate the person that he respects the most. And after Ashvale antagonizes him a little bit, he says he'll definitely be able to take down the Herald of Death himself once he has his transformation surgery. Now, this transformation surgery is the same as the conversion surgery his squad mates talked about getting earlier when we met them at the studio. Apparently, all society members get this happiness surgery, and this surgery basically makes the recipient unable to feel anything except joy. It's just 2 quick needle pricks under the eyes and boom! No more sadness, no more pain, just a lot of brain damage. Because as Ashvale points out, we feel pain for a reason. Physical and emotional feedback is how we feel the boundaries of the world and ourselves. And without that negative feedback, we could accidentally or even intentionally hurt ourselves or others without even realizing it. And even on a more philosophical level, this happiness surgery is a pretty terrible idea. As Pearl says, as an example, the power of human artwork and thus imagenesis comes from a profound understanding and interaction with the world's negative feedback. In other words, suffering. She also says that happiness surgery does more than just eliminate one's sense of pain, it also strips humans of all their complexity. It makes them one-dimensional. So even if you were to look at AHA and say, oh, this is the laughter, they only experience joy. The thing is, AHA derives joy from the complexities and surprises of life. So eliminating every emotion but joy is not elation. So while I get the appeal of happiness surgery on paper, it do be a very bad thing. But here's the thing. This isn't the first time we've seen happiness surgery. We've actually seen this exact situation in Star Rail once before. Can you guess where? Well, this next scene between Dan Heng and Blade is a hint. Because Blade says there's something calling to him from somewhere in Planarcadia. And you remember how Yao Guang said she foresaw a calamity unfolding on Planarcadia and that it was tied to Blade? Well, don't worry. Blade is not the Herald of Death. SHUHU is the Herald of Death. So in case you forgot who SHUHU was an emanator of abundance, a tree-like monster with 1,000 faces. He was originally defeated and sealed on the Luofu, but back when Blade was still known as Yingxing, he and Dan Feng tried to resurrect their friend Bai Heng, and then Blade got cursed or infected by SHUHU's remains, which then cursed him with immortality and madness. So he effectively became Mara-struck. Now you're probably wondering why I'm singling out only SHUHU specifically instead of just gesturing to the power of abundance more broadly. So let me take you down a very necessary but windy rabbit hole for a second. So SHUHU seems to be a reference to the yokai Jinmenju, a tree demon that produces thousands of flowers in the shape of human heads. Legends say that if you ask the flower heads questions, they will laugh and laugh and laugh until they wither away and die. Now with that in mind, let's take a look at how Fulwish's followers are depicted. Notice how they are all wearing smiling flower masks. Couple this with the ginkgo leaves on Fulwish's skirt and how she insists that the happy do not die, and you have a whole group of Mara-struck individuals, people. After all, ginkgo leaves grow on the Mara-struck, and Mara is a condition associated with immortality, and it starts with the mind. And both the society members and Mara-struck hear voices that aren't really there. It's just that Fulwish has convinced her followers that that is the voice of AHA that they hear. But as Sunday points out, that voice does not belong to AHA. So for all of the above reasons, I think that happiness surgery is just a process by which Fulwish inflicts Mara upon her followers. And we'll cover the details of the surgery in a second, but I want to point out that Fulwish has never received the surgery herself. Her Mara came from somewhere else. If you've read her medical records that were available last patch, they claim that after recovering from the injury inflicted upon her by the Herald of Death, she lost the ability to feel or express pain, and she gained the ability to detect the desires of the people around her. And she could also induce hallucinations in other people by just describing their desires to them. That latter ability was dubbed happiness grammar and seems to be the source of her powers of persuasion that Asheville thought came from a supplicant mask. Which is probably true, as I do think the Cthulhu-esque mask belongs to her, and we know that the masks amplify a supplicant's natural ability, so if she already had happiness grammar, then the mask would just make that grammar power stronger. More on mask ownership in a second, but what we really need to answer first is, how did Fulwish get Mara struck in the first place? Well, I suspect she was infected when she came in contact with Marcus Entali, the Herald of Death. Because here's the thing. Marcus Entali was a scholar from the Intelligentsia Guild's School of Evolutionary Perfection, as was his colleague Bartwell. Now, during the Herald of Death trials, Bartwell claimed that Marcus received funding from an unknown source to pursue, quote, redacted cellular composite reconstruction technology. Now, I personally think that this research was related to SHUHU, or at least the Abundance, because the Abundance is well known for its gifts of immortality, which includes cellular regeneration and reconstruction. So I think his experiment ended up infecting him with what I'm going to call a seed of SHUHU, which then got amplified by the supplicant mask that he wore. And that caused him to become Mara-struck and mutate into some SHUHU-like abomination, a Jinmenju. After all, he was described not as a man, but as an unidentified creature in his investigation files. And that's why it took so long to identify him and execute him. They didn't know who or what he was. Fulwish even described him as having a fibrous structure and corolla-like appendages. A fibrous structure could be like a tree, while a corolla is a part of a flower, and that sounds exactly like SHUHU. Now, the Mara-struck often turned violent, so that could have been what caused the murderous rampage. And I think picturing the Herald of Death as a sort of plant gives new meaning to his calling card's name, the Bloody Bloom. Now, Dan Heng tells Blade that he thinks SHUHU might be trying to resurrect himself through Blade. And I think he also tried to resurrect himself through Marcus Entali. This is what I think the seed of SHUHU is, a means by which SHUHU can return. So with that in mind, I think that if Fulwish was injured by Marcus, then she may have a seed of SHUHU inside of her too, and that caused her bizarre condition, which she's now trying to spread to as many people as possible. And she's doing that through happiness surgery. Now, I'm not totally sure if Fulwish is actually trying to put spores inside of people or something, or if there's actually a little mechanical device that she's injecting beneath the eyelids for this happiness surgery thing. Because the Xianzhou does have a little injectable device that helps people forget painful experiences, and that can delay the onset of Mara. Well, the transformation portion of it. So it's very possible that she has a similar device. She could have developed a device based on the Xianzhou's technology that would have allowed people to only feel joy. And just so we're clear on a few things, Marcus belonged to the Intelligentsia Guild, which is currently run by Yabuli from the IPC's technology department. And what's really suspicious about that is that Yabuli was the one who paid out the compensation money to the Herald of Death's victims, and she was also the one who received all of Marcus's belongings after his execution, which leads me to believe that she also funded his initial cellular regeneration research. Now, I don't know how SHUHU would have gotten to Planarcadia exactly, because technically speaking, SHUHU's body is supposed to be in a lockbox inside the shackling prison, but then there's also a piece in Blade, and then apparently Asheville's arm shadow thing also ate most of SHUHU. So my guess is that Yabuli managed to get some sort of fragment of SHUHU from the Xianzhou, and then she gave it to Marcus for his projects, and then we ended up here. Now, some of my assumptions might be a little off base, but I thought it was really important for you guys to understand exactly what we were dealing with here, because SHUHU is the link that binds everything together. SHUHU connects the Herald of Death to the copycat killer, to Himiko's fate, to Blade's foretold disaster, to Asheville's current predicament, and even some of the dark backroom dealings of the IPC. And once you realize this, the mystery becomes a lot easier to follow, and it also makes it a lot easier to spot things that might be important. For example, Kuchiba. I mentioned I was really suspicious of her earlier. That is in part because Asheville has not been wrong yet, and he thinks that someone in the Department of Aberration Defense is responsible for these killings in some way, and she is part of that department. And partly because her name means withered leaf. And since we're dealing with the abundance, that's a little suspicious to me. We'll revisit this SHUHU stuff one more time before the video ends, but we've got a festival to put on first, and to ensure its success, we'll need to locate the author of Fluffy Across the Blue and convince them to attend. Fortunately, we've already met her. It's the former head of the Furbo Weekly tabloid and walking financial disaster, Pearluxe. She's pretty easy to convince. You just gotta put a little pressure on her wallet and bada boom bada bang, big name author's attendance is secured. After arriving at the venue and giving a quick interview with Fulwish TV, which is a questionable decision in light of what we know now, the Trailblazer gets gut-butted by Evanescia, who is such a big fan of Fluffy Across the Blue that she just had to attend the Star Rail Fest for herself. Evanescia then confirms that the Trailblazer's mask is not a real supplicant mask, but a mask that she imagenesis to see if she could fool the Phantasmoon. And she could. She tags along and formally introduces herself to March, who might be getting a bit too good at this whole remembering the future pure child of remembrance thing. Because the first thing she says about Evanescia is that a fox girl could never have bad intentions. It's not like she's Fantilia or anything, right? It's not like this is a repeat of the situation with Tengyun again, right? I mean, this planet doesn't even have an ambrosial arbor, right? Spoilers, it does. The Panarch Elwood in the Phantasmoon Courtyard is technically an ambrosial arbor, and Evanescia is its avatar, or something along those lines, which kinda would make her Fantilia-esque, but less hostile. Now, interestingly, if you play through the new Divergent universe, you're gonna read a myth about how Aha created Planarcadia by planting a flower and then raising the Phantasmoon. Now, it might not be a flower exactly, but it could be a flowering tree, because I do think this myth is referencing the Panarch Elwood, which, if true, means the entirety of Planarcadia is built on the power of abundance. And for all we know, the ambrosial arbor could be linked to SHUHU directly. Perhaps SHUHU is the embodiment of the ambrosial arbor plague mark. That's probably a theory we should do some other time. Regardless, Evanescia was entrusted with overseeing the Phantasmoon games, so the idea that the flower that Aha built Planarcadia around is the Panarch Elwood just makes sense. Anyway, it's a good thing Evanescia is here because Sparksy decided that she hadn't had quite enough high school roleplay yet, and she gives us a Fluffy Across the Blue pop quiz. And we cannot answer these questions even though the comic is based off the adventures of the Nameless because the comic is highly embellished and sometimes built on lies. Like, I bet you forgot we never told the Cosmos that Cocolia was actually the villain, so now the whole universe thinks that she's some kind of hero. Fortunately, Evanescia knows these comics inside and out, so she answers for us. Now, several of the exhibitions are based off of planets that the Nameless have visited and their adventures there as portrayed in Fluffy Across the Blue. And fittingly, upon reaching the Xianzhou exhibition, we're supposed to be playing alongside actors pretending to be the High Cloud Quintet. And those actors just so happen to be the Daybreak Squadron, who are all likely artificially Mara-struck except for Cinderborn. So he's kind of like the Jing Yuan of the group, the only unstruck survivor. Turns out these guys are also supplicants in the Phantasmoon games and are the co-wearers of the Cthulhu SHUHU Squid Tree mask. Try and say that 3 times fast. They challenge the Trailblazer to a fight, lose, and then make a strategic retreat so that they can regroup, giving the Nameless an opportunity to fill Evanescia in on all the inaccuracies of the Xianzhou arc and the comic. She responds by saying that she doesn't really think the abundance is actually all that terrifying. In fact, she thinks they make a pretty good match for the elation because it's only with infinite life that one can pursue infinite joy. It's a very Buddhist perspective, but it also makes sense that she'd think that way since she is born of the abundance, or is currently an emanator of one. I'm not really sure which it is. And it is nice to see the abundance get some good representation this time around. We really missed that on the Luofu. But this is as far as she goes for now, because it's time for her to return to the Phantasmoon Courtyard so that she can observe the next part of the games. And that's when she gets to have a very strange conversation with Yao Guang, who recognized the Panarch Elwood as an ambrosial arbor during her last visit to the courtyard. Although she does not believe Evanescia when she says that she is the tree. But although the abundance is a natural enemy of the Xianzhou, the two seem to be on amicable terms for the time being, so that's nice. As the crew enters the Penacony exhibition, Sparkle tells them that the interview the Trailblazer did with Fulwish TV was highly edited to make the Trailblazer appear more hostile and is currently being broadcast all over Planarcadia. Looks like Fulwish wants to make the Trailblazer appear violent like the Herald of Death. Instilling fear into the general public benefits Fulwish in two ways. First, it makes her eternal happiness proposal far more appealing, and second, it makes a Trailblazer a subject of bad attention. Bad attention apparently means negative wish power, and the thing about wish power is that, much like attention, if you can't control it, it controls you. But there's nothing they can do right now except chase after the Daybreak Squadron, who are definitely acting on behalf of Fulwish, and beat them up, because goodness, would you look at the state of all this slander. But before we can do that, they stuff themselves inside a giant mecha pom-pom. Why pom-pom? Well, because slander. They don't see the Astral Express as heroes, they see them as liars. They want to show Planarcadia just how violent the conductor of the train can be. This is propaganda. Negative propaganda. And it is a tough fight, one the Nameless almost lose. But fortunately, Asheville's on the case. With a simple vow uttered, he reveals himself to be La Mancha, leader of the Galaxy Rangers and a supplicant of the Phantasm Games. And as Mecha Pom-Pom fires off dozens of missiles, Asheville unseals the shadow within his arm, which attempts to devour the Daybreak Squadron inside. But the Imagenicist, Astral Express they're riding on, takes a sudden nosedive and crashes into Terminal Station, land of the sneering gods. A location that looks a hell of a lot like a black hole with enormous rows of teeth. This place is apparently within the world on canvas, which also means it's possible that this place is related to the crash site of the real Astral Express. You know, the one that Himiko presumably found and fixed up. But low-key, I think this may actually represent Terminus, the finality, hence Terminal Station. And I wonder if anywhere the Express makes its final stop can be considered a terminal or final station. And maybe the areas surrounding the Terminal Station always look like this. Alternatively, this could be Veracity related. But for now at least, it seems like the Mecha Pom-Pom fusion caused something to snap within the brains of the Marastruck, leaving them unable to feel anything but happiness. And that's when it's revealed that they were the ones responsible for the slaughter at the Sinwish Syndicate. They are the copycat Herald of Death. So Asheville deems them guilty and allows the shadow in his arm to devour them whole, leaving only Magnus, behind. After all, he never underwent the surgery and he didn't participate in the slaughter. He is innocent. But as the crew is trying to figure out how to leave the terminal station, the Trailblazer hears their own voice coming from the abyss, and they call themselves Akavili. But before it can lure them into the void with promises of eternal bliss, Asheville snaps them out of it and claims that something is sleeping here, something familiar. Then, without warning, whatever's in that abyss begins to seep out through the world on canvas and into the 3D plane, creating fissures throughout Planarcadia. The fissures are quickly patched by Pearl, who also pulls the crew back into reality, thanks to that tracking device she gave them. She then explains that this terminal station is actually part of a torn scroll, a fragment of the world on canvas that split off of Planarcadia during the conversion of the 2D world to the 3D world. Torn scrolls apparently create tears in reality, but as far as a reason why they do this, I can only theorize. My best guess is that they were once spaces that were not allowed to become real for one reason or another, and are now trying to realize themselves into reality. That's just a theory though. Hopefully we get to explore that in the next patch. Pearl proceeds to effectively summarize all of our case findings thus far and confirms that she's been quietly guiding Asheville's investigation as well. His job hasn't really been to uncover any new information, but instead to confirm what Pearl already suspected. And if she had been correct about the Abundance's involvement, which she was, then she would need the power in Asheville's arm to deal with it. Asheville's arm is really scary, man. It devoured 2 emanators and the propagation swarms, which is crazy, and somehow he seems to have gotten it from Icy, a former navigator of the Express. And this guy knows Blade by his original name, no less, which means it's possible that Asheville is the reason why Blade hasn't been completely lost to the Mara yet. Because Asheville's arm, remember, ate SHUHU. So it's possible that Asheville was able to remove most of SHUHU from Blade or something along those lines. I'm not really sure. But it's also worth mentioning that whatever's in Asheville's arm is recognizing the power of SHUHU from within the abyss in the torn scroll. What that means, I don't know. I'm sure we'll find out. And just when you think everything's over and settled, the rules of the Phantasmoon games change. By order of the laughter itself, whichever supplicant wins the games will not receive a single minute of Eonhood, but will instead become Aha! So that's fun! And that's also where we're gonna leave it for today. I contemplated putting all the SHUHU stuff in its own video, but because of the shortened patch cycle and the fact that so much of it is so intricately connected to all of the other plot points, I decided to just leave it in here. There's only really one thing I want to mention that it seems important, but I just didn't know where to put it. When we were being toured around Pearluxe Corp, Nihilux mentions that we no longer have the ability to produce massive Imaginae, like we could once upon a time. Giant Imaginae apparently require a massive amount of wish power and for most of Planarcadia to break free of the mental shackles of impossibility. The fact that she's even talking about this means that at some point in the near future, we're gonna have to do exactly that. So I think that's where we're gonna leave this episode. I just wanna thank you guys all so much for watching. I'm sorry these are so long, they're just very detailed. There's a lot going on, and I appreciate you guys sticking with me. Hopefully you'll remain sticky enough to make it to the 3rd episode, which is just around the corner. So do not wash yourself, stay sticky until I see you again, okay? Okay, thanks again for watching, I'll see you later, bye!